Welcome, everyone, to the GCC Tech Investing for Non-Techies with Stephen Forte. Is a native of Southern California. Stephen lived in China for a decade and is a software architect, speaker, and entrepreneur with a special focus on artificial intelligence and computer vision. He is an expert in mobile software with 28 patents filed and 14 awarded. Stephen has founded and exited multiple tech startups, including Ascendant Systems, sold to BlackBerry for a multiple of 14 times sales. Stephen has been CEO of public and private companies, managed field operations in 63 countries, and led P&Ls from startups to over 1 billion. Stephen has also held many leadership roles in YPO and is currently the chair of the YPO Gold Santa Monica Bay chapter, regional chair of the Technology and Personal Investing Networks, and champion for the YPO Silicon Valley and World Technology Summits. Stephen, it's great to have you on. The floor is yours.
Hey, thanks, Tim, and thanks everyone for being here today. I have a fairly dense deck today I'd love to go through, and I'll start sharing the screen, and I hope you all find it kind of interesting. So I'd like to highlight a couple of things to say first. I'm not an analyst, I'm a technical guy. And as a technologist, I really focus on talking about companies that I really follow from a technical perspective rather than, say, doing any sort of analysis on their cash flows or earnings, what have you. The companies I've talked about, or I will talk about, were really about guys that are doing interesting things in this space. And because I know we all have ADD and YPO, I'll move fairly quickly through lots of slides. Rest assured, though, we will send out a PDF of the presentation, actually a printable version, a bit later. So you'll get a chance to see some of the tickers and the stocks and things that I talk about without having to take notes as you go. So a couple of things I'm going to cover today. We're going to really talk about several different categories in technical investing. The one thing you'll notice I don't have here today is blockchain. I think we've all had a little bit of blockchain fatigue in YPO. It is a relevant topic. For many reasons, I'm not going to highlight it today, but I think you've all been bludgeoned with enough blockchain for a while. So it is obviously a very interactive, kind of visual presentation, so I won't be reading the slides. So if anyone's participating audio only, you're probably going to miss out on a lot.
As you look back with the advantage of hindsight, how have the companies performed that you highlighted previously?
Well, this is the fun part, right? Because history says it all. So it's been kind of fun to see that. So one of my first sets of pin talks were in May of 2017, and since then, since that, I guess it was May 7th or so, the S&P 500 is up about 20%, and lo and behold, a lot of these stocks that I highlighted are up quite a bit more. And I did some talks in this year. I think I did about a half a dozen or something earlier this year in 2018, and since then the S&P's down actually about 2.5%, but the companies I highlighted in those presentations are up about 18%.
This is an impressive spread, especially with the S&P index. You know, I'm curious though, Stephen, any particular outliers among the 31 stocks that really moved the needle?
There were. I certainly didn't predict any of these, but Intelsat was an interesting one on the upside. FCC opened some new spectrum, which they gave them a boost, plus they had a new satellite program from the FAA. And on the downside, this Acogen, they have plasmycin, which is one of their drugs, was approved for UTIs, but wasn't approved for bloodstream infections, which is what they were hoping. So those are kind of my outliers on each end, you might say, but it's been kind of fun tracking these things as they go. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about technology before we dive right into the companies and what's happening now. So things really are changing faster than ever before. And I feel like we've heard this, and you're like, okay, the internet was booming in the 90s and mobile in the 2000s. Why is it different, and what's really happening? So for some of you who've attended Singularity, you may recognize some of these, but I wanted to highlight a few components. One, these innovations don't happen as a straight line. It doesn't, it's not one technology innovation. Every year things get better, computers just get faster. It's really a series of nested innovation curves. So we started with the relay, we went to the vacuum tube, transistors, integrated circuits, now say to quantum. So these nested curves are what start to create this kind of linear focus, but it's really not linear. It's really this accumulation. And the key is, of course, getting the investment timing at the right spot. You don't want to be too early or you're waiting forever. So you've all heard about 3D printing by now. I don't know how many of you know the history of 3D printing. So it was invented about 30 years ago by Chuck Hull in 1986. Timing matters, because if you're too early in the process, and again, we all think linear. We think growth 5% in our companies every year, or we go from 11th grade to 12th grade. Technology increases exponentially. So the real key is getting that investment timing right at the knee of the curve. So if you invested in 3D printing, say 30 years ago, it's probably not going to be a very good return for you. However, if you're getting involved maybe a couple of years back, or even now, frankly, because I still think it's in its infancy, then you have a chance to really get an interesting return. So part of what we'll focus on is a bit of timing. And, I typically get asked, why is this different? Why is it different than these other kind of boom times we've had with the internet or with mobile? And it's predominantly because what I call the tech multiplier effect. And it's really the accumulation of technology where innovation itself is allowing innovation to happen faster. So if we take things like sensors, edge computing, which we'll talk a bit about, smarter sensors and things happening in the cloud. The cost, it's certainly getting far less expensive to develop things. You've seen this alone with your personal electronics. And this carries on to all of the development, whether it's flat screens or AI. Obviously, AI being able to accelerate all of this. And I'll talk about why AI doesn't just accelerate it, but it actually kind of gives a different bent to how we do innovation. Crowdsourcing. You can find the best of the best anywhere around the world. All of my engineers are scattered around the world and most are part-time. And I can find the best talent that way. And I use it and I leverage it. 5G, we'll talk a bit about that. It's a bit more than just faster than 4G, and we'll talk why. But that's the fabric that allows all of these things to talk together. Blockchain, of course, the ability to have distributed safe data. And quantum. So all of these together are going to start to create a massive acceleration. We've only seen the very beginning. And there's a couple of little outliers that are poking to get in. One's biocomputing, and we'll talk a bit about that too. Why does that matter? It's really amazing, and it's near term. This isn't stuff we're looking at 30 years down the line. And solar. Electricity is becoming extraordinarily inexpensive. So the average price per kilowatt in the United States is about 12 cents. Saudi Arabia signed a contract last year and sent a bid out for 2 cents per kilowatt. So soon we're going to start to see this ubiquitous notion of really upending Keynesian economics. The most interesting thing is that scarcity is over. We all thought we were going to be out of oil in the 1980s, right? So technology gets better at finding it, gets better at using it, and makes things more efficient. So I think we'll see a lot. So one of the things I tend to really focus on, and I do for especially public company investments, is saying the companies you get involved in, you need to make sure that they're really embracing at least one or more of these exponential technologies. If in fact you don't see in the core strategy of the business you're investing any of these segments, then they might be one of the ones like Polaroid or others that have been steamrolled by new technology. So I'm going to talk briefly about quantum. I didn't list it because honestly there's not much public investing opportunity, but it's interesting to note because quantum, what it really does is decouples computing from energy. So when you really talk about making computing cheap, you might hear these Bitcoin miners that have set up massive facilities that suck down great energy. That's limited time for this world, anything that consumes that amount of resource. So China has some of the largest supercomputers in the world. Their Tianhe are their computer, $400 million system. It's about the size of a football field. Absolutely amazing facility. Just to give you an idea of where that fits, I had mentioned there's little opportunity. Here's the computer system as it sits in China, and this goes on for about a football field, by the way, just to give you a sense of scale. So this is a massive supercomputer, tons of Intel cores. This is what's going to replace it with quantum. This chip. The box for the chip is going to be a bit bigger, simply because it has to be cooled. So the cooling systems on quantum are actually liquid helium and generally hover around negative 269 degrees Celsius. So some pretty interesting stuff, but like I say, limited public investing opportunities. So we're going to fly right through that. We will talk a bit about artificial intelligence. I think everyone, you can't go a day without seeing this in the paper, and it's such a motherhood statement. Well, AI, what does it mean? Everyone's claiming AI, from its Expedia online to the guy who's probably dry cleaning your shirts, right? I've got an AI system that's making your shirts whiter. So I thought I'd highlight a bit of really what's happening in the space, and we'll start maybe by defining a few things and what types of AI there are. So there's automated intelligence. Makes sense, right? You have the automation of manual tasks, something that's going on today. There's assisted, helping people perform tasks better or faster. Augmented, making better decisions in terms of expert systems, info systems, and of course autonomous. And autonomous becomes interesting because this is where the system is really doing things on its own. I think many of the computer programming jobs will go away in the future because you'll be able to have the computer program what you want. You'll be able to design and say, this is the look and the feel of the website that I'd like to have, and the computer is going to write the code. It won't take someone pounding on keys to make those kinds of simple programs. So in addition to those types of technologies, these will be adopted in particular waves, and this is worth noting for the investments that you get into. So one is, of course, the internet AI. This is recommended engines. This isn't just what you click on Google. This is a bit more. It's kind of where do you hover your cursor as you're surfing the net? Are you lingering on particular web pages? What Facebook videos are you watching, right? It's a bit more insight. Business AI is really about, again, finding causation that you might normally not find in your analysis. So what did I miss? What correlations of data are we missing, say, in the market that we may be unaware of? Perception, well, you know, you've heard about IoT, all these devices. The world is full of sensors now. So AI, it's about getting eyes, ears, and all these other senses we'll be bringing into AI and doing some pretty amazing things in the physical environment. And then, of course, autonomous AI. And autonomous AI, think of things like swarms of drones that can selectively spray and harvest entire farms. Computer vision with, you know, remarkable dexterity, heat-resistant drones that can put out forest fires at 100 times more efficiency, or level 5 autonomous vehicles that can travel and go wherever they like. I think it's really fun when you start to integrate AI, machine learning, and robotics. So I thought I'd share with you just you know, a little piece. This is Boston Dynamics, and this will give you a little idea of what you can do when you tie AI and robotics. So the agility and intelligence to know what to do. More than that is tenacity. So when you think about innovation, it's fun to think about how many times a computer may try to solve a problem. When you think about us as individuals, we may not be as resilient as that little robot on getting something done. So robots and AI will attempt to solve a problem with just as much energy and power and excitement, essentially, at its 1000th try as it would its first try. And, you know, humans aren't really quite like that. AlphaGo Zero is interesting because AlphaGo is part of Google, where you may have read, became the best chess player and best AlphaGo player in the world. I think the most interesting part about this is simply that it not only played chess and Go faster, but it was simply taught the rules of Go and the rules of chess. So it learned how to play it itself at 80,000 moves per second. And the shocking thing, of course, to most was that its approach to gameplay was very, very different than the human approach to gameplay, making moves people had never seen and obviously winning. So the exciting part here is that AI won't just make, say, our drug discovery faster by doing what the humans would have done faster. It essentially may take an entirely new approach at solving problems that we frankly never considered. So there is going to be a huge impact in the economy. This is what McKinsey has predicted. You can see the scatter plot of industries and the impact in these industries. So if you're investing in retail, obviously, if there's not a massive AI strategy there, you may want to think about a different company to invest in. I highlight this one company because I find it interesting, Tiao. It's a Chinese company founded in 2012. They did a investment round from Sequoia in 2014. In 2016, they had 78 million daily active users. Now they have over 120 million. This is an AI bot that searches the net with 4,000 sources looking for news stories that they think you're interested in. It then takes those usually brief news stories and rewrites them for you based on how you like to read and the way you read things and what you're attracted to. So this company, by the way, is worth $2 billion now. So it's pretty interesting to see that AI can actually recraft and rewrite stories, and they claim that they can figure their customers out within 24 hours. So what's happening in AI? Well, we've got drug discovery, new materials, obviously going to be huge. Alibaba, for those of you, and you'll notice in this presentation, I'm going to talk a lot about some Chinese companies because a great deal of the innovation in many of these fields isn't happening in the United States. So if you really want these sectors to be represented in your portfolio, you need to think about getting involved in some of these other markets and, frankly, following where the innovation is going to be. So Alibaba, their AI beat humans at reading comprehension, not math now, reading comprehension. Beijing announced plans to build a $2 billion AI research park. Again, the government's quite involved in China. Alibaba is doubling their R&D spend, and we just see some amazing things that are happening there. It's obviously a double-edged sword. AI is still being weaponized by terrorists or predatory governments, could attack the U.S. grid. So there's a lot of dark side of this too, but there's some amazing things happening. So autonomous driving is really the mother of all AI, simply because there's really no margin for error. Nvidia, and you'll notice this company will come up quite a bit in my presentation. They make predominantly a lot of the GPUs that are used in this type of calculation. Their car computers can calculate 320 trillion deep learning operations per second. So you think about that for a moment, that's fairly amazing. And this is happening now. Silicon Valley startup doing self-driving technology with Ryder and Elect. This stuff is, by the way, being commercialized. So FedEx is using autonomous driving so they can platoon their trucks and they draft behind each other, saving fuel. US Express loading this as well. So all of this stuff is actually being commercialized and marketed today. So new specialized AI chips are going to be required, and this is where some of the investment opportunity comes up. So certainly Nvidia has been a big benefactor of many of these companies getting in. Actually, they're one of the best manufacturers in the world of these GPU, but there are lots of new companies getting involved. And part of what they're doing, and if you're in this space and you're looking at the silicon side, the future really appears to be building systems as a chip. So not just a GPU, as you might see with some of the historical NVIDIA products, but ones that build systems on chip. And I've highlighted a few here that you may want to take a look at that combine and remove the bottleneck of memory and kind of heavy I/O back and forth.
Stephen, are there any big innovations on the horizon that may create material shifts in terms of the the AI hardware industry? I'm just curious, if you are seeing any new winners or losers starting to form out there.
Certainly are, Tim. I mean, so the big innovations are likely to come from people building systems again. So, a great deal of the fabric, fabric circuit boards, and I'll talk about a few of those. A great deal of the bottlenecks have been the communication between the components. So if they can put all of these components together, it'll certainly increase their capability. So, when you're looking at the investment side, I mean, it's pretty interesting to see that AI is really going to exceed the need for silicon is going to exceed what we've seen even previously for servers, like out of Intel. Nvidia, again, they're going to start to face a bit more competition than they might have had in the past. And there's going to be probably a new wave of M&A of these smaller chip makers that are building these systems on chip being acquired. And certainly that's, I think, where a lot of the investment opportunity can be as well. China is working quite hard to build independent semiconductor industry, and there's going to be really a great deal of innovation taking place there. And as I'd mentioned, AI is a huge focus for Alibaba and many of the state-owned enterprises. So this starts to create kind of what I call a fab frenzy. So all of these things I've discussed really require silicon. They need to be processed on something. So I think there's a huge opportunity in the Fab Guys, the guys who are making these chips. So AI-related hardware and software is going to jump significantly in the next couple of years. So focusing on some of the folks that make this stuff is certainly going to be interesting. Again, China is not only where it's being made, but there's a great deal of innovation that's happening there today. And you can just see from the demand going from 350 billion to 500 billion in 2020, it's really a pretty massive market. So I'm really looking hard at what companies can kind of serve this market. And this kind of reminds me of the gold rush. I just came back from Alaska, and it was interesting to see as I learned that no one really made money in the gold. All the people that made money were selling the picks and the shovels and maybe owning a saloon. So in this case, the folks that are making the equipment that will actually make these chips, I think, are well positioned. So some companies I find that are doing some real interesting things in this space are listed here. In the I guess in the respective time during the presentation, I'm not going to talk to each company or what particularly they're doing. Again, I'll be sending out the copy of all these, so you don't necessarily have to write down the tickers in the event you're interested, but I will highlight some. And you'll notice again, I don't just highlight US companies, I also talk about some predominantly China and Japan, although there's a couple of European companies sprinkled in. These are some additional companies I find that are doing some interesting things. I will highlight one. ASML is really interesting because they've actually created a new technology that will allow the chips to be made better. They're a Dutch company. They have this EUV technology. It's extreme ultraviolet laser. And a great deal of the chip manufacturing is with lithography. And it's the ability, almost like silk screening a shirt, it's the ability to make the integrated circuits on the silicon. And it accounts for about 30% of the cost of manufacturing a chip and is frankly one of the technical limiters to putting more semiconductors on a particular piece of silicon, so allowing you to have density. So these guys have created technology that through this new laser can essentially not only take about 30% of the cost out of that manufacturing process, but even allow for greater density on the chip. So they're the only ones who are doing this. They have a backlog of these machines that are 120 million bucks a piece, and it's just a great invention. And talk about a great pick and shovel to sell to the miners. Everyone's going to need that technology going forward. I think they already have 30 sold for 2019. So it's an interesting company. So with that, I'm going to shift from AI over to life extension and genomics. So it is hitting a tipping point. And look, I think not only is it an interesting investment space, but look, I'm YPO Gold. We all want to know how we're going to live longer and how we're going to live a better life. So there is a bit of a tipping point. There's an estimation that in 10 years, every year we live after that, we'll gain about an extra year of life based on technology and new advancements. And that's pretty exciting for us. More exciting, I would say, probably for my daughter, but certainly exciting for folks most of our age. The advances are coming across multiple disciplines, and they really will improve life and health. I think one of the coolest things you're going to see that's happening now is that it's going to shift healthcare from kind of symptom-based, hey, I'm sick, going in the doctor today, to a predictive medicine model, to where we'll be able to see things coming and can actually do something about it. So if your investments are in this space, take a hard look. I mean, it's obviously a $3 trillion global healthcare market, huge opportunity, but there really are going to be some new winners and losers in this space.
Steve, maybe we can pause here. Can you highlight some of the most interesting advancements that you're currently seeing in the genomics sector? I'd love for you to expand on that.
Certainly. I mean, it's really exciting. There are different companies doing different things, but some of the key things are, say, Parabiosis, which is essentially taking blood and plasma from old creatures and replacing it with blood and plasma from young creatures. And they're discovering that when this is done, that they've done this in mice, that they're healthier, that they're younger, they regrow hair, all sorts of stuff happens. Now, by the way, it works the other way. So if you take old blood and put it in a young mouse, it gets old faster too. So I guess that's kind of a one-way thing you want to employ. Telomeres. So these are the DNA caps, and they shrink every time a cell divides, and when they get too short, they're too short to protect the chromosomes inside. And this, again, starts to facilitate aging. So there's new technologies that are allowing these caps to stay strong. Rapamycin is kind of an interesting accident from Novartis, because this was originally a bacterial agent used for transplant victims, and they're actually finding this anti-aging. So they discovered within mice, as a matter of fact, it expanded their lifespan 25% and protected against many cancers. Genomics and sequencing, as many of you know, is an underlying technology that's really allowing for a lot of these advancements to take place, which is pretty exciting. Craig Venter's Human Longevity Inc. is doing some amazing stuff, and you're actually doing some YPO stuff with them in San Diego. Senescent cells, this is kind of interesting too. I hadn't heard about these until just a couple of years ago, and these are cells they've identified that are, I guess, part of the aging process, and they've discovered if they can actually remove these cells, that old mice can run faster, improve organ function to live about another 25% faster. So a lot of the companies that we'll look at, and some of the public companies, of course, are focusing on these spaces. So Global Longevity Index is doing quite well, as you can see. I think it's a space that's going to certainly continue to grow. I kind of track this index to see, but I mean, it's really going one direction, and I think it's going to continue to do quite well, because we really are in the infancy. So some companies that are doing interesting stuff. So again, I'm not going to roll through each one of these, but you'll see a few of them pop up. By the way, on some of the slides, I show the same company twice. So if they're participating in several different spaces, I list them again, and it gives you an idea depending on what space that you're interested in. But there's some pretty cool stuff happening with all these guys. And you'll see Illumina come up and Novartis come up a couple of times with some of the things I've been tracking. Second page of guys to take a look at. Agilent, again, is doing some interesting things, NeoGenomics. So again, you'll get a chance to roll through some of these when I send the slide out, but these guys are all doing interesting things in the space. So there is a bit of an arms race. It's predominantly led by the US and China, and it's becoming quite competitive. China's really investing heavily, both as a state and as companies. So you can just see, 9 billion investment. We didn't, at least for us folks in the US. We haven't done so much from a government level. Most of our input has really been through private companies. Mapping a genome is getting cheaper and cheaper, as you can see. So some interesting stuff that's taken place. Unfortunately, many of us know that cancer has become quite prevalent around the world. 14 million new cases every year. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount. That's just stuff that's reported. It's way more than that. Chinese doctors recently cured 33 out of 35 patients who had melanoma A blood cancer, and it's really starting to get interesting of what's happening. Liquid biopsies are really going to be the future. So the fact that you can take this drop of blood and detect 13 types of cancers, using AI for not only analysis and diagnosis, but being able to put together a patient treatment program is really pretty awesome. And like I'd mentioned, just being able to do stuff with a drop of blood is pretty cool. These are some of the companies that are doing that in the space. You'll notice Nvidia's here again. Again, they make some of the engines that power this stuff. So they're really part of it. CRISPR, for those of you that are certainly doing just amazing things. I mean, if you look at the fact that they're able to even get their patents granted within China, that's pretty exciting stuff. For those of you who maybe haven't done business in China in a while, the old days was when China would just intrude on all intellectual property. Now that they see the future really being on creating intellectual property, as you would expect, their IP laws and defense have really gotten much better. So some companies to look at here. Toray is pretty cool with this liquid biopsy that I think is really interesting. So again, being able to take a drop of blood, I wouldn't think it's so far away that you'll be able to take a drop of blood, put a little mechanism on your smartphone and do remote blood diagnostics for doctors. And I think we're starting to see some little pieces of that. So being able to do kind of remote healthcare like that, I think is going to really open up a huge opportunity for lots of others. Some other companies that are doing interesting things again in the space. The Loxo Oncology has this product called latrinib, and it's an oral selective inhibitor of tropomyosin receptor kinase. So it's kind of interesting because they've discovered this protein that signals and creates cellular communication for tumor growth, and they found a way to retard that, which is obviously great for cancer, and that's kind of looking interesting in their portfolio. So we'll shift gears once again, and now we're going to talk about edge computing. Edge computing is, I wouldn't say entirely going to kill cloud, but it may. Edge computing is the thought that cloud computing is getting too latent for what we need to do. So there's just too much latency. So real world data is being collected in real time. Again, vision, location, temperature, IoT sensors are collecting this stuff 24/7. And there's just huge amounts of data that are being collected by these worldwide, and you just can't always send them to the cloud for look and analysis. And much of that intelligence needs to now be processed really on the device itself. So you're going to see devices getting smarter and smarter because, again, having every device send something to the cloud, send it back, have the intelligence happen there, there's just not enough time. And when you think about, again, automated driving, you have no time to go to the cloud. So this is by far the coolest car in automated driving. I think you'd all agree. I love this thing. So of course it's Nvidia again, but I'd love to see this thing on the road one day flying by me on the freeway on the way to Vegas. I think that would be pretty cool. So autonomous driving, as I'd mentioned, is really the mother of all AI. And they can generate 10 gigabytes of data per mile. That's massive. And you have to respond within a single millisecond response time. You don't have time. So if it takes 150 or 250 milliseconds to communicate with a data center, That's 21 feet at 60 miles per hour. So clearly the idea of cloud intelligence just doesn't work. So it really has to be done on site. And this is where machine learning comes in. So it requires machine learning, machine vision, and everything has to take place really on the vehicle. So and on the vehicle, you can't have 50 terabytes of data that describe every possible move the cars around you are going to make. So you have to actually have a learning algorithm. And some of that comes through machine vision. So I'll give you a quick example of machine vision software applied to a video you may have seen on how machine vision can instantly and instantaneously identify what's in motion. You might recognize it. You can see the computer identifying every object along the way. And this was done in real time. And this is what the automated car will see. So it's pretty amazing stuff when you see what has to take place within these vehicles or within these, frankly, any of these machine vision tools. So being able to not only not hit the car next to you, but really predict, understand what that item that you're driving by, and all this, again, has to happen on the device. So it's really going to catalyze this rapid adoption of edge computing, and this machine learning has to happen, again, because it can't go to the cloud. So who's the beneficiaries of this? Where does your investment go? So certainly, once again, the chip producers are going to be the major benefactors. So we talked about not only AI, but when you take AI and you couple it now with machine vision and these types of devices, scaling computing, it's really believed that edge computing is going to scale along the same lines that we saw with mobile. So it's just going to be absolutely massive growth. You're going to have intelligent devices down at very low cost. I mean, look at LiDAR, for example. Just a couple of years ago, LiDAR was $75,000 per vehicle. Now it's under $500, which means that's going to continue to go down. You're going to see sensors in your tennis shoes, and those are going to be smart sensors that are going to calculate the data. Today, they're pretty much dumb sensors. They might send the heat or the temperature to something else. Soon they'll calculate and they'll take action, and that's pretty exciting. So here are some of the leaders in the space. Some of these guys you'd seen before, again, Nvidia once again, but someone has to make those devices. Someone has to create them. They have to be run on processors. It all comes down to hardware once again. So we're really heading into another hardware boom, I believe, as this develops. One particular I find kind of interesting is Crown Castle. These guys own all the cell towers. So think about it. When you think of all the cell towers that are around a city or a country, each one of those has all of the air conditioning and components and things that you need to put a computer center. And it could be pretty cool. So there's a huge amount of data being generated. And the big question is, where does it all go? So along the way here is, you'll recognize this slide that you maybe saw before earlier in the presentation. And what I see happening here is actually a new one. And this is biological. So there's a tremendous amount of data that's being stored from all of these AI machines, and you just can't do it with the existing technology. So DNA storage is really becoming quite interesting, and I'll talk a bit about some of that where it creates investment opportunity. There's more data created in the last 2 years than the previous 5,000 years of humanity. I mean, it's unbelievable. And when you see graphs like the one I displayed to you, you know that that can't continue, that our existing technologies of data storage really aren't capable of storing that. So this is real. It's happening now. There's dire warnings. We're out of memory grade silicone by a certain period of time. And again, we were supposed to be out of oil by the 1980s. But the encoding digital data in DNA will kill incumbent business models. So DNA storage technology can shrink a 200,000 square foot facility into the palm of your hand. So think about that, right? All of the data on Earth could fit in the back of an SUV. So that's how materially different this storage medium is, and how when we think today that there's a ton of data being generated, where are we going to put it? How are we going to store it? How much energy does it take? Again, there's a new S-curve of development that's going to solve that problem for us. I mean, the genomics professor in Harvard, George Church, had given the idea that you could essentially create a camera with no mechanical components. You could paint this DNA material on a wall. If anything interesting happens, you could scrape it off and read it. So it's not that far away. So the big players here really are Intel, Micron, and Microsoft. So if you're really interested in this space, there are the guys who are more on the DNA side, like CRISPR and Illumina, that may help that writing. But those are really the public ones to focus on. I think Microsoft is going to be the winner myself. They're really doing the most in this space. They really look at commercializing this in the next couple of years. So this isn't space stuff that's off a million years away. So 5G, and apologize, I have to continue quickly, but there's lots to cover because there's lots of cool stuff to do here. It's not just 4G. It's very different. Extremely high frequencies in the 30 to 300 or 3,300 megahertz range. You can put 1,000 more devices per meter than you can with 4G. So there's lots of different shorter wavelengths, so you can have smaller antennas. China's really leading the way. ZTE recorded download speeds 19 gigabits. Look, your fastest cable modem at home is probably 300 megabits. So 5G is about 63 times faster. You can download a full movie in about 3.6 seconds. So it's pretty amazing. They're actually being helped a little bit now that we have this. We've kind of held back our H-1B program, so China's leveraging that by keeping a lot of their best engineers in China. So again, once again, we're really competing. When you look at a countryside, you need to look more for a lot of investment there. I apologize, I'll roll through some of these quickly. Here are some of the companies you ought to take a look at. Again, not a whole lot of time to hover on these. I will send them out, so I won't sit on this slide too long. There's a couple of other sectors we're going to talk about. Cybersecurity, you can't not talk about this in this space. Lots going on. You all heard about the Uber breach, 57 million customers and drivers hacked. The funny thing is they got their credentials from GitHub, which is a public repository where you put code, you can work with developers, open source, and solve problems. But anyway, big mistake. So small mistakes can have large consequences. Huge amount of hacks. Data breaches are becoming invaluable. There's a couple of interesting things that happened. There's this Meltdown Inspector that came up where there was yet another hack where people were able to actually detect information from multiprocessors. So you can actually hear what one thread in a processor is doing. So this space is always going to be interesting from an investment perspective. Baidu is doing quite a bit. So, it's really worth taking a look at them if you do include Chinese companies in your portfolio. It will be weaponized, as you would expect. It's just what typically happens. Most companies get breaches from cyber blindness, by the way. There's just too many warnings in their networks, and they can get through. So some interesting stuff happening with these companies as well. So some companies to watch. Symantec's doing some cool stuff. They've actually blocked several big attempts recently. FireEye put a question mark because they do some really interesting stuff, but I think it's just a terribly run company. I bought the stock a while back and they just have gone nowhere. So I'm just hoping they'll get acquired at some point, but we'll see. One more segment I'll hit is defense. The Hypersonics arms race many people haven't heard of. The tagline here is, now you see it, now you're dead. But there is a real issue now with AI dominance. And it's, the next war is not going to be fought with aircraft carriers and human infantry, but it's really going to be robotics, drones, and AI and cyber. The US, in many ways, is still preparing for yesterday's war really, while China and Russia are really focusing on a lot of the newer technologies. Just real quickly on this technology, stealth is very different. These hypersonic glide vehicles and cruise missiles take an entirely different trajectory, so they really can't be shot down. So say even in the U.S., some of our ships, about the fastest we can shoot something down is about Mach 3, and these are traveling 5 to 15 times the speed of sound. So it's going to create a whole new arms race. And what's usually interesting, obviously, about these kinds of things is that it, creates some new investment opportunities. I'll roll through quickly on some advancements that have happened in Russia and China, because I know we're running a little late on time. And we're doing a bit in the US, but really ratcheting up defense is interesting. So for those of you who followed politics, you've seen that there's been a big push on NATO to spend up to 2%. And smaller countries are certainly increasing. So you can see here from the graph that there are a ton of companies who are going to be, or countries rather, that are going to be certainly increasing their investments. And it's going to make great opportunity, I think, in the defense space. So from a US standpoint, if you really look at the guys who play in that space, you'll see these companies here. So you've got Lockheed, Raytheon, BAE Systems, others that you might normally expect to see in the US defense space.
And Stephen, given that you've spent a decade living and working in China, I'm curious, what considerations should we make on China when developing our own tech investing strategy? This has all been really good.
I think China really needs to be here. They really need to be represented in your portfolio, because having a myopic focus on the U.S. just really doesn't tell the story. I'll go through really quickly on some of the stuff that's happening in China, because it really is interesting. So if you look at GDP, things are changing. So if you look at, say, the top 3 markets in 2050 and how that's going to look, it's going to be quite different. So it's a matter of whether you want your investments to be kind of, what Wayne Gretzky used to say, where the puck is going to be rather than where it is in hockey. That I think the future of a great deal of the tech innovation is going to be in China. An interesting stat I thought I'd post as well, if you look at social media platforms as a nation space and population, Facebook and YouTube are the 2 largest nations on Earth. And that's kind of funny when you see the impact of 2 billion people. Real quick on the China side, there's some stuff going on there worth paying attention to, simply because they're creating the new Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau Bay Area. This Bay Area is a massive space. Even just small provinces within the space are huge, and in U.S. perspective, Guangzhou, 14 million people, $284 billion GDP. It's pretty big, and will become the largest Bay Area in the world. So when you look at investments and the companies that are really going to grow there, with that Bay Area having 66 million population and a GDP of 2 trillion, it makes New York metropolitan area look kind of small. So certainly it's not your father's China, really, if you want to put it that way. It's not your father's Oldsmobile, that old commercial. It really is a hot house of innovation. There's lots going on in the space. A lot of the innovation, a great deal of the patents are happening there. It's process innovation, and making stuff matters, and we just don't make stuff anymore in the US, and they do. And that's how you continue to innovate, is through the process of making stuff.
Stephen, I've got one more question for you, and then I want to open it up to some of the questions that have come in from our listeners. And you've shared some amazing potential investment opportunities in the tech space with us today. From everything I can see, this feels like a college course today with all the material, but definitely a world of opportunity for investors to consider. What are your greatest concerns related to public market investing in technology? It can't be all sunshine ahead, right?
It never is, right? So there are a few things I kind of put on my radar. There's always uncertainty, as we know, but I thought I'd just highlight a few things, and I'll roll through them quickly, because they're far less analytical, maybe you'd say, than the things I'd highlighted. I think we're kind of addicted to low interest rates. It's kind of like this crack addiction. And I think what concerns me as I look at that is, are we really moving the goalposts? Are companies truly more valuable now than they were yesterday at the same PE? I don't know. And I'm a pretty visual guy. So when I start to look at graphs and I just see things that look like outliers, like the price to revenue ratio, is it warranted? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it's just fine. But when I see something historically like this, it just causes me a little alarm. PE ratios, I still get a little concerned. Things just look a little crazy. The other thing I look at is, we're in a much smaller population of public stocks in the US. So we have a ton more money going into fewer public companies. And I think also there's going to be a big tech backlash. And, it's just a matter of time until people start getting upset. So we've seen what's happened in Europe. They're really leading the way with the $2.7 billion fine with Google. I think we're going to see a lot more regulation. Breaking up Google into a bunch of little Googlets, I don't think is going to solve it. Germany is going after Google, looking at they have 90% market share. Should they be treated as a utility? And the question is, should we regulate it or not? If we regulate it, we might not be as competitive. And from a competitive nation standpoint, maybe China takes the lead. I don't know about trade war, whether that really concerns me. I think there's some issues there. If I was Bezos, he's a smart guy, but I wouldn't own the Washington Post just to get out of the crosshairs myself. But there's lots of policy. And then algorithmic trading, and I'm just whooping through this fast because I know we're short on time. It concerns me a bit because we don't really know what it does, and we're not really sure about the impact. So there's so much of this algorithmic trading going on. What really happens with liquidity? Does a plunge in liquidity cause a great threat? The computers all seem to buy at the same time. The question is, do they sell at the same time? So if you look at the flash crash, for example, it's kind of interesting to see that, in 25 minutes, 2 billion shares changed hands at $56 billion. I think if a human was involved, it might have stabilized simply because they're kind of playing the long game. And, it's just kind of strange. So the kind of the final piece that I look at is the massive amounts of money that are going into index funds. So you have $597 less billion of active investors, people who are really scouring P&Ls and going through balance sheets and looking at stuff, and everyone's dumping their money. And when you have, I think it's 5% of the S&P is held by Vanguard index funds, it just gets a little weird and, a little uncharted. So we'll have to see where that goes.
Wow. Yeah. I'm assuming this is Q&A time now, Stephen?
Yep, we can't tell with that slide. It's Q&A. I went a little longer than I intended, but there's a lot of material there. And I know as I've done this many times live, people do like to hear each segment. Again, obviously this is being recorded, so we'll have a chance to go back through if you missed something on that. And of course, I'll send out a digestible, printable version of the slides.
Fantastic. Well, I'd love to share. We don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to jump right in. Jack has a question for you. What is the process you use to find these companies, technology, and spaces?
A lot of it just comes through the voracious reading. I go through a lot of material. It's what I love. It's what I enjoy. I don't do this for a living. I obviously run a company. But when I start to see company names recur, and it's not just news stories. I read a lot of scientific studies. I do a lot of the deep science stuff, Electrical Engineering Times and others. And when I start to see innovations, I start to see companies that are partnering with MIT or others for patent licensing to commercialize something. Those are the kinds of things that then kind of make me take note and follow one of these companies that are doing interesting stuff. Again, I'm not an analyst. I don't look at their cash flow statements. I don't see what their cap tables are. I really don't do that. I really focus on who's really doing interesting stuff that seems to be, doing something material in the space.
Would you have any suggestions on websites or periodicals or places that people could go and do some of their own reading and research?
Well, I have a really varied reading list. I mean, I read all the stuff we normally do, whether it's Wall Street Journal or what have you, but I really tend to focus on reading engineering material. So I try to skip all of the reporting bias and get right down to what the engineering times are saying, what's happening in more of the technical newsletters. I read stuff coming out of the engineering schools, whether it's Viterbi at USC or stuff coming out of Harvard. Where are they focusing time? What sort of innovations are they doing? What companies did they partner with? What discoveries were made? And is there another company that's licensing it? So I would say it's really reading off the beaten trail. And if there's a particular space you're interested in, like AI or those components, really digging into, both scientific papers and, even, it could be published news stories, but I probably get a lot less information from standard news than most.
Okay. Scott sent in a question. He's curious how you're finding your part-time engineers around the world.
Well, I actually speak on a great deal of that through the future of work. I use Upwork a lot. Actually, a YPOer runs it, as well as Freelancer and a couple of other sites. So if I'm looking for straight freelancers, I'll go to those sites. I have a full process of how I run my business and how I engineer and find these guys, how I manage the work, the tools I use. It actually should be a separate GCC because it's the future of work. The way it's done is quite different. And when I'm looking for a particular talent, I tend to hit LinkedIn. I look for people who work for a specific company that develops the technology that I like, and I start sending blind emails, and I usually ask for referrals. What's interesting you find on LinkedIn is when people lose their job, that they never remove the company that they currently work for until they get a new job. So reaching out to someone, they may no longer be employed. I focus on companies that also have some downsizing and others. So I spend probably 15% of my time just searching for talent.
Curious, when you think of where your daughter is currently in her use of technology, do you see a fairly big gap between sort of where we are, right, as CEOs and versus where the next generation is and just their proficiency with bringing in all this new technology? I mean, it just feels like we're drowning. It's tough to keep up with all of it. I'm just curious.
I'm starting to see a really big digital divide. And frankly, unfortunately, it's not like with my daughter. She'll be a consumer of some of these services and frankly, maybe manipulated by social media. But the real divide is going to be those who have technical skill. So the demand for people with mathematics, engineering, and other degrees will continue to scale. Those with liberal arts or more soft services will decline. And I think the future world of employment is really being a subject matter expert, because we're really getting to levels of specificity that people need to hire for. So I think the role of the generalist is kind of over in many ways, which is a little concerning. I think we're going to have some issues in the future in terms of work and social impact.
Yeah. I know we're just about out of time, Stephen. Curious if you have some parting comments that you'd like to leave with our group, and then I'll come back to one final question for you.
I think simply that the spaces I identified plus blockchain, blockchain's again different because it's more of an enabler. It's less of a space, but these are the segments of the world that are progressing. And I think so many are not. So I couldn't imagine ever having less than, say, 80% of my portfolio in this space.
Fantastic. And I'm going to put you on the spot here, but what's your favorite technology quote of all time? Can you come up with one that you love?
There are so many good ones, but one of the best is what in the world would anyone want a computer on their desk for? And I'm paraphrasing. I don't remember the exact quote, but if you remember some of the quotes early on when the PC was being developed, and people, who would think that? I was in the mobile business, and I remember people carrying the big cell phone down the street, and you're wondering, what the hell do they have to talk about that's so important they need to do it down the street? Who would have thought that everyone in the world will end up having one of these devices?
Fantastic. Stephen, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your presentation today and volunteering your time. And from all of us here at YPO and the Personal Investor Network and the Technology Network, the Entrepreneur and Innovation and the Financial Services Network, we really appreciate it very much. So
thanks, Tim. Great chatting with you. Great to be here.